Welcome to Getting In, a College Coach podcast. I'm Sally Ganga, your host today. In my third segment, I'll be welcoming my colleague, college finance expert Michelle Clifton, regarding the federal student loan update. So if you have student loans, listen in. But first, for those of you who are watching the video, you will actually see Dr. Mark Butt, Director of Admission at Emory University, who will be my guest for the first two segments. We'll be talking about Emory itself, but also, I think as importantly, the state of undergraduate admissions and also advice for applicants. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. It's always fun. We have a pretty deep and broad amount of expertise on our staff, but it's still always good to get the most current voices, present voices in college admissions. So thanks again for being here. So let's start right now with Emory. I figure well, I'm really interested in the broader state of college admissions. I'd love to hear you just kind of describe Emory, like kind of the elevator pitch on Emory and what makes you feel proud to work there. So why don't we start
Yeah,
with that?
sure. For those listeners who aren't as familiar with Emory, we're a private research university in the city of Atlanta. We're in a neighborhood called Druid Hills. We're actually the second largest employer in the entire state of Georgia behind Delta Airlines. So when you include the 11 hospitals and the graduate programs and all the divisions of Emory, we have about 36,000 employees at the university. So it's a massive research enterprise. It's roughly a $10 billion research enterprise that has a deep commitment to research, to improve the state of humanity, teaching, and then service to the state of Georgia, to the United States, and then the world broadly. And so we're really lucky that at the undergraduate level, which is sort of where I focus my time, we have a very small undergraduate student body. I really kind of classify it as an academic boutique.
Mm-hmm.
And so we only enroll about 1,400 first-year students into the college. And then we actually have a very unique kind of New England style liberal arts college called Oxford College, which is the historic founding home of the institution, about 40 minutes east of the city. And they enroll about 450 first-year students. And so we have a small division and then a really small division. And so we're really committed to connecting that sort of next generation of scholar with current leading experts in their fields, regardless of what they think they're going to do. Most 17-year-olds that have things they like and things they don't like, and that's great. And but the high school experience is pretty narrow for students academically. They're really only kind of taking 5 to 6 academic areas: English, math, science, social science, global language, maybe visual performing arts. But for us, we teach in 70 academic areas. And so we want to make sure that for that next generation archaeologist or public health expert, they are connected with these thought leaders in these spaces that are thinking about what the future looks like and how to solve current problems, innovate. And so Emory is really kind of designed to do that, which we think is really exciting. It's very liberal arts centric as far as the undergraduate experience goes. And then for our upperclassmen, we do give them 2 pre-professional options, one in nursing and then one in an undergraduate business school.
Okay. All right. That's super helpful. So this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's so important to ask it. So it's fine if students apply undecided, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in reality, this is always a big question we get asked, but in reality, most students are going to be undecided, right? In most high school students, while they may have found something that they really enjoy, most just haven't seen that ecosystem of, what the world looks like as far as the breadth of academia. Most students think, I tell this in my information sessions, but most people think anthropology is a store, not a major, right? So I want them to understand what that is. What does it mean to understand culture, right? So thinking about, what does it mean to understand the performing arts, or thinking about the humanities, comparative literature. As I mentioned, most high school students have a pretty narrow high school experience. So even if they have found things they love, coming in as what I like to say is open-minded, because
Hmm.
it gives students the idea that it's okay that they haven't made a choice yet, right? And that's uniquely like a hallmark of the American experience. I work with a lot of international students where applying to university is about knowing already what you want to do. Whereas in the US, one of the benefits of that is that it's okay, and we encourage you to explore and take that time.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is particularly I think international families who kind of really struggle with this, but not exclusively. So and it does get complicated because some colleges like Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, you have to declare a major. So I have some
Correct.
sympathy around that, but these kind of mid-sized to small liberal arts and sciences colleges and universities are very flexible, and I always like to emphasize that.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm kind of interested. I mean, I worked at Reed College and University of Chicago, so I personally experienced like how much more competitive, like while I was at Chicago, it started getting enormously more competitive. And since I've left, it's become much more. And I've seen a similar kind of progression with Emory as with a lot of other colleges who are sort of that are kind of positioned the way Emory is. And I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that and how it's maybe changed the admission landscape for you, and even if you could broaden, or I should say for those of you at Emory, and even how you kind of like how do you talk to applicants about things differently now than maybe you did 10, 20 years ago?
Sure. It's a good question. I think, when I was on the high school side advising students, which I did for 2 years, there was sort of this paradigm of what sort of many, sort of high achieving students wanted. They wanted academic choices, they wanted connections with faculty, they wanted accessibility, they wanted to be in classrooms with people who are really different from them. And it would sort of fit this mold of being a medium-sized, research-intensive space that was in or near a city, right? And so places like the University of Chicago or places like Emory, they really kind of fit that mold, right?
Mhm.
And so they're really attractive for students, particularly when they're traveling from far away. They're pretty easy to get to. I mean, we're really lucky here in the city of Atlanta to have the world's busiest airport. So you can really get anywhere almost all the time. And so we really try to leverage that here. And so I think for us, over time, we've seen, continued interest in like a place like Emory over the past 12 years that I've been here. But the faculty, when we speak to them, their values remain core and strong, which is around small teaching environments, classrooms where those connections are really fostered and where students get to meet people who are different from them, and they get to have that rich dialogue when they're talking about complicated issues, whether it's global conflicts or new things on the horizon in STEM. They don't just want to be lectured at, right? If they wanted to be lectured at, they would go on YouTube and choose a lecture that they wanted, right? And so, but they want to be in an immersive learning experience. And so for us, to your point, we have more and more interest, but as a residential institution, we haven't grown. The class
Mhm.
size, the enrolling class size has not changed over time, neither at Emory College or at Oxford College. And so for us, that just kind of pinches us in the enrollment space because we're really thinking about how do we still maintain that experience for not only our students, but also for the faculty, right? And so I think in the college search, many students kind of forget about the faculty because they're kind of thinking about themselves, but our faculty are world class and they are doing high volume, high quality research, and they're looking to mentor that next generation of student.
Yeah, so you can't just expand just because the interest is there. I
Correct,
think, yeah,
correct.
I think that's
Especially, I
very.
mean, if you want to expand, you got to build a residence hall, right? In most cases, for these residential spaces, we require students to live on campus for their first 2 years. And so until institutions choose to build residence halls, they're going to be that same academic boutique that they've always been.
Mhm. And frankly, you probably couldn't build enough. I mean, to bring it down to the selectivity where it was,
Correct.
So, yeah, so absolutely. So because of all that, um, what are like, has that changed what applicants should know about admissions? Like, we can talk initially about Emory and then kind of the broader state. Like, what should applicants know? I mean, they don't have anything to compare it to, but I regularly have conversations with students and parents where parents will say, well, that school is a safety. And I'm like, not anymore. I mean,
Right.
first of all, a safety for who? Because every student is different.
Right.
But also just know how much the landscape has changed really dramatically as we sort of just addressed. So just kind of curious, like what's the advice that you would give to an applicant to Emory and kind of generally applying to schools that are in that highly selective category, maybe not, the Ivies, but really what we call Ivy adjacent at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a good question. And I actually think that the number one thing that students should do in the process is take some time to disconnect from media, phones, computers, all that stuff, and really sit down and reflect on what is important to them.
Hmm.
Like write down pen and paper, what are you hoping to get from your college experience? What does that look like visually? Where, what, how, what those types of elements of the college experience, what are those things, right? What I compare it to is I always say it's very easy to be enamored by things in the marketplace if you don't know what you're looking for, right? So I tell people if I go to the grocery store and I don't talk to my husband before about, what we're thinking about or what I need to get, I'm going to walk into the grocery store and be like, oh my gosh, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want everything, right? Everything looks great. And I'm going to get to the checkout and be like, oh my gosh, what did I do? The college admission process can kind of be the same if you don't prepare. Everything's going to look great. Colleges are going to put their best foot forward. You're going to find really, really great things, out there in the marketplace. But in most cases, unless you kind of know what you're looking for, it's going to be difficult to sort through such a vast ecosystem. And so once students have kind of reflected and said, hey, these are the things that are really important to me, whether it's class sizes, whether it's research, whether it's, geographically, financial aid, it can be a whole bunch of these different elements. Unless students know what they're looking for, working through the marketplace is really, really difficult, right? It is more difficult now than I think it was even 15, 20 years ago. And so I think step number one, yes, reflect, talk to people who know you about, hey, what type of places do you think I would thrive? And one of the last thing that I like to mention about sort of a piece of advice I like to give students is when you're speaking to either someone who knows you well or your guidance counselor who's sort of an expert in this space, um, ask them for a dark horse. Ask them for a wild card institution that they should investigate because in most cases, students and college experts live in different social worlds, right? And so there's a lot of information that college advisors and experts who've been in the higher ed space, they know a lot of really fantastic places that students just aren't familiar with,
Hmm.
right? And so kind of trying to find a way to bridge that, like, give me a dark horse, give me a place that is off the beaten path that I should investigate, that I should look into, that you think I'm overlooking in the process. And I think you can really find some interesting places to at least expand that world, right? Because it's that same 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the students are looking at the same 20 colleges, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so kind of building out that breadth, I think is really important for students.
And yeah, one of the things that I've started saying to students is test your hypothesis. You have a hypothesis that this is what you want. But frankly, you've only been to that kind of school, or you've been to no schools, or you only went
Right,
to a football game at that
right,
school. You need to test the hypothesis looking at the classroom experience and not just the social environment, which I
that's
think
right,
is
that's right.
understandably where they go first because they sort of can't conceive of how different like a huge school might be from a tiny school, from a mid-sized school, from, etc. So,
That's fabulous advice. I'll co-sign that all day.
yeah, well, it helps with the scientists, because often I used to sort of talk about like experiences and like none of it made sense to some of them. And then I'm like, you have a hypothesis, you always need to test those. And they're like, oh, right.
They're like, I like this.
Yeah, exactly. So, um, all right. Well, it is I think that this is actually going to be a really good time to end our first segment. So, everybody hold on because Mark is going to be coming right back to continue talking about the state of college admissions. Welcome back, everyone. And welcome back, Matt. Thanks again for being here today.
Thank you.
So, I was hoping we could get pretty concrete at this point. Like, if a college admissions applicant, if you're having a one-on-one conversation, let's say this is like a friend of the family, so you can even be like a little more blunt to the extent that you're
Mm,
comfortable. What are beyond that kind of broader reflection, which I think is super important, and really thinking carefully about how you choose a school, not just choosing based on prestige, but based on
mhm.
your experience. And by the way, I want to say to people, if you go to our website, blog.getintocollege.com, we have a lot of information about that that really echoes what Mark is saying. And I think it's wonderful that both sides of the desk, we are saying the same thing. But so if a student is applying to Emory or another highly selective, college or university, what are sort of common mistakes or assumptions that applicants make that you'd want to educate them about?
Sure. I think there's kind of two things that I like to mention. The first is that a little bit what I mentioned before, Oxford College, right? So Oxford College is this small New England style
Mhm.
liberal arts college within the research university. A lot of people are just not familiar with it, right? Or they've heard about it, but they don't actually know what it is. And so I do think, kind of in the larger sense of do your research, I do think it matters that you understand what you are applying to and kind of thinking what might be the right fit. And so sometimes we'll read writing of applicants, and it's kind of obvious that they haven't done their research because they're talking about things that we either don't offer or they haven't gone far enough. And so I think there's a difference between um, sort of familiarity and then knowledge, right? And so
Mhm.
there's some students who kind of go as far as like, oh, I'm familiar, right? I've heard of it. Maybe I've kind of browsed the website, but they kind of stop there. And it's when you're reading an application, it can be a very striking difference between a student who has gone so far to be familiar with professors and ecosystems of learning and research and specific programs and versus name and the sort of superficiality of the process. And so I think that's number one. I think number two, I think just being being consistently engaged in conversation with the family unit about the cost of higher education. I think
Mhm.
that is something that a lot of students, I think they're aware of it, but they may not be, it's not being sort of forefront for some families. And I think there is a growing and increasing cost differential between public and private education in the United States. And I've attended both. I've been to public institutions, I've been to private
Mhm.
institutions, I've worked at both as well, and they are very distinct and they are very different, and there are cost differences. And so I think getting comfortable talking about finances, I think, is really something that families can grow into. Some families, they just don't want to talk about it. Even if they can afford the cost of a 4-year private higher education on their own, that is still a significant investment, regardless
Mhm.
of what your income bracket is. And so that just because you can afford something doesn't mean you should. And I
Mhm.
think that families, students, should be having that conversation about value, about what they're seeking, and what is going to be worth their dollar in this process.
Mhm. I think that's so important, and having that conversation directly. The parents don't have to disclose all their financial information to say this particular bill is not going to be possible
Correct.
for us. And so applying to a school that doesn't give merit scholarships or gives very few might not be the best idea,
That's right.
right?
That's right. And
So,
just having that conversation, I think growing in that comfort space within a family
mhm.
unit about talking not only about academic fit, but also financial fit, personal fit, social fit, all of those kind of layers, I think is really important. And I found that some families are a little bit more reticent to discuss the cost. But in the end, the rubber meets the road at some point, right? The bill will come. And
Mhm.
I think for parents, they should be comfortable talking to their children about the cost of higher education because there is a broader message there about how do I approach a big decision,
Mhm.
right? How do I approach a big decision? How can I be methodical, thoughtful, reflective, intentional? Because that process will come up again, right? Whether it's buying a home, whether it's choosing a life partner, whether it's buying a car, right? Choosing a job, like all these big decisions that we make in our lives, you know, this college admission process is kind of priming and showing students how people in a contemporary society make big decisions and how they think about it. So while it might be uncomfortable to kind of talk about some of the financial elements, I do think it is a kind of teachable moment where parents can imprint that decision-making process about really big things that are important.
That's so wonderful, and our college finance team would love you, like, they would absolutely. I mean, they might have to come in and, like, do a clip. "This is from the director at a private university that's expensive, and he's saying this too." So, I just wanna cap this off, though, that by saying that if you cannot afford, like, if you come from a low income family, there is nonetheless need-based aid, and I always wanna emphasize that sometimes a school like Emory will end up being less expensive. I
That's
know
right.
this is true because, I attended Reed College. I got financial aid, I did take out loans, but one of the things that was notable, this was a while ago, but the very high need, very low income students graduating from Reed had lower loan indebtedness than from the state universities. On average, of course,
Yes.
right? And there will be exceptions, but I always want to emphasize that Emory, my sense is, gives quite solid financial aid. Doesn't mean it's going to be everything everybody's hoping for, but if you are low income, still apply.
That's right. And I think there's some really good cost aggregators out there right now. Myintuition.org is a really, really good one where students can and families can work through their finances. And there's, aggregators that can say this is what a more modest package would look like. This is what a very aggressive package would look like. And, especially for places that offer no loans as part of their financial aid like
Mhm.
we do, it is something that can be, depending on where students fall on the income level, it can be very surprising, like to your point, oh, Emory is actually more affordable than I thought it would be because the difference between the sticker price and what we're actually going to pay is very reasonable.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good. All right, so if we can switch gears, I wanted to talk a little bit about the different elements of the application.
Mhm.
Students are always and families are always confused about the importance of GPA versus the transcript, and so I was hoping you could kind of dive in a little to what you look for. You've got two students with 4.0s unweighted GPA. Are those students going to be looked at exactly the same way if the classes they've taken are different?
Yeah, good question. So I think before we even get to that transcript, the first
Mhm,
thing that's really important for families to know is that, in our process, here at Emory, we have territory assigned admission officers, and it's really important that they know the high schools that they're reading. And so there are thousands of different high schools around the United States, and even more when you look beyond the borders of the United States. And so um, many of our admission officers have spent years reading the same high schools and worked with them over time as they have evolved their curriculum, if they've made different academic decisions. I'm
mhm,
often asked when schools are changing their curriculum, hey, what do you recommend? How do we do this? What are your thoughts about this? And I always am happy to be a thought partner with schools as they think about this process. But it's really important to remember that each student is kind of situated in their own high school first and foremost. And so we look at the individual student in the scope of opportunity provided by their high school. And so that is sort of the first frame that we're coming in with. Once you kind of open the doors of the high school and you're looking at the academic record of the student, we're looking at, first and foremost, did the student take challenging courses based on what was available in that ecosystem? And that can be different depending on where that student is geographically or the type of courses that are offered at that school. It could be that sort of most common advanced placement or AP curriculum. It could be a dual enrollment curriculum at a local community college based on what was available. It could also be the IB or the Cambridge curriculum here in the United States, and then overseas a variety of national curricula as well as international curriculum like the British system, for example, or the French baccalaureate. But first and foremost, we are looking to make sure that the student has been exposed to rigorous academic coursework that is covering, core content pretty deeply, but also at a pretty quick pace, right? Our faculty, being experts, they move through core content really, really quickly, and they do expect that students from the jump are ready to kind of get into those sort of deep academic areas. And so making sure that students have seen rigorous courses. So we talk pretty extensively about curriculum choices that students have made within the context of their school. We're looking at the core, so English, math, science, social science, global language, and then depending on the school, visual and performing arts. And we're very consistently going through that core. And so when students are doubling up or dropping courses in the core, we are capturing that. We are very, very granular about the course selection. Because again, here at Emory, we don't admit to major. So we want to
Mhm.
make sure that the students have had that academic bread prior to coming in. So for example, here at Emory to graduate, you have to take a year of global language, right? So like that is the requirement. So it is helpful if you have seen 4 years of global language all the way through high school and that you're interested in continuing that during your time here. It's also a part of our value set, right? We want to train our students to experience a global community, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
be able to be multilinguistic and bring some unique linguistic capital to not only their careers, but also the world. So beyond grades, we are looking at courses, right? Courses first, and then we start looking at how well has a student done in those respective courses. And we start to notice trends. Students are preferring math and science to the humanities and social sciences, or inverse, or they're, like I mentioned, doubling up and doing really well. We want to capture all that information. Now, individual schools do different things with that, as far as like high schools do different things with that, whether it's calculating a class rank or sometimes a county rank, or maybe they're doing unweighted GPAs or weighted GPAs or deciles or anything of that nature. That for us is more inconsequential to us, that sort of how the school is sorting, if you will, their students. We kind of set that aside because that is more of a localized process for us when we're looking at the transcript. One, coursework; two, grades; and then three, is that student demonstrating any type of trend either towards academic areas or away, or over time. Like one of the questions we'll often ask is, as the rigor increases, how do the grades fall? Right? Do the
Mhm.
grades move up, similarly? Are they holding steady? Are they going down? Are they bifurcating? What are they doing? Um, the reason why we do this is because here at Emory and a lot of our peer institutions, we do a lot of research. We do a lot of research on how to predict how well students will perform on our campuses academically. And when we look at predicting how well students perform on campus, the number one thing that predicts how well they're going to do is their transcript.
Mhm.
So we spend the most amount of time on that document. I would argue that it's probably about 50% of our time reviewing an applicant is spent looking at their transcript.
Mhm. I think that's so helpful too that you're framing it in terms of preparation for college, because I'm always struck by students not sort of thinking about that. Like
Mm,
they view the courses they take as a series of hoops to jump through instead of understanding. I mean, sometimes I think the engineers understand that math is going to be important in physics,
sure.
but not but there can be kind of a lack of understanding. If I want to be a business major, economics is going to be a good idea, and increased rigor is going to be helpful if I go to a more rigorous school, right?
Mhm.
Like it's so I'm so glad to hear you frame it in that way.
I
Anything
think one
else
of
that
the other things too, if I can add, is that it also allows students to determine if they like something.
Mhm.
Right? Like some students are told, oh, you should be a doctor or you should go into business. And they take their first class in chemistry and they're like, oh my God, like I hate
Yeah.
this. You know what I mean? Or I thought I wanted to do this and then I don't want to. And so that's sort of what you like, I think matters, right? I think when you're looking at, how well students do in college, there's sort of this old age or sort of this old adage of that happy students do well, right?
Mhm.
So you should be taking things that you're really interested in because you are going to persist and do well in those courses.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%. And if your strongest courses are your history courses, you might want to think carefully about whether computer science is actually going to be the right pathway for you. So,
Exactly.
just some things to think about. Anything else that you would want to highlight? I mean, I can ask about particular sections of the application, but I love how you framed this. And so, maybe what would be the number two thing that you look at after the transcript? Or do they
Yeah,
all
I
kind of
mean,
end up being pretty equal?
yeah, I mean, obviously the transcript is sort of the foundation of the house, but I think for us, one of the things that we really, spend a lot of time talking about again is student context, right? We're thinking about What has the student's lived experience been up through being a 17-year-old? What perspectives are they going to add to the classroom? So I always imagine when we're talking about applicants at the committee table, I always imagine like a social science class that's talking about a very hotly contested topic, whatever that might be. And I try to make sure that the students sitting around the table have very different lived experiences and perspectives, whether that's coming from inside the US or outside the US, whether that's coming from rural environments or urban environments or
Mhm.
suburban environments. I really want, college for students to be reshuffling the deck where they are meeting people with experiences and ideas that they have never been exposed to, because it may challenge the way they think and it may help them go through what I like to call that sort of disequilibrium phase, where they thought was true, now they've met people who are really challenging that idea and they are actually developing a new understanding of that topic, right? And
Mhm.
so I think for me, that's one of the most important parts of an undergraduate experience is the people you meet. And so we're thinking about our classrooms as being a way to foster those differences in dialogue so they can be in contact with people who think differently from them. They have different political backgrounds. They may have different experiences, come from different types of families. And so when we're going through applicants and we're thinking about students, we're thinking, yes, about their ability to be successful academically, but we're also thinking, what might the student contribute to our campus community in the residence halls as well as in the classroom?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I love that you brought that up too, because I kind of put that under the category of diversity. And when people hear the word diversity, they think ethnic, racial, which is not allowed anymore after the Supreme Court decision. Diversity is still important to colleges. And frankly, we know it is important to students as well. So
That's
I
right.
think that's really important to note. So I think so we definitely have a few minutes left. So what I was hoping we could do is, would you say that Emory, from your experience and talking to colleagues at other colleges, because people at colleges talk to each other, and I think people applying to college think everyone's in competition, and there's a little bit of an
Mhm.
element of that, but frankly, it's an incredibly cooperative profession, because ultimately people are also very concerned about the students and the student experience and how to do that right. So just kind of could you address, I mean, I think that what we're listening to, you how you describe the Emory process is going to be pretty similar to other colleges and universities in your position as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think for us, many of us who have dedicated our lives to higher education and sort of society at large, sort of keeping the fabric of what does it mean to live in a democratic society? What are the values we want to share and sort of inculcate and sort of make sure that students are going forward with that? I think for us, we are drawn to this profession because we want to invest in other people, but we also believe in the power of what these institutions can do. And what
Hmm.
does it mean to connect experts with that next generation of scholar when we're thinking about solving, a wide variety of complex issues that societies, are handling, are dealing with. And they can be in the health related spaces, they can be political, they can be in a wide variety of spaces. But I think for us, bringing different people together um, is really, really important to us. Fundamentally, when I talk to colleagues at other institutions, we are pretty aligned in our missions and our values because these institutions exist mainly to transform the lives of students, but also foster these democratic values, which are so important to us in society.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. How can we create a more ethical society, a kinder society? I feel like I remember at Reed, um, every year there was a debate between a couple professors about whether Reed actually makes students better people.
Mm,
And and it was so interesting to listen to it. And obviously, in plenty of cases, no, but there was a certain training in, is this the right thing to do, and how do you define what the right thing to do is? And I love it when that's
mhm.
part of, like, I went to graduate school at a Jesuit institution, and ethics were brought into like pretty much every single class, which
Sure,
I
sure.
loved about that. So,
I love that.
yeah, yeah. So I want to go back to practical again. Does applying, and this is one of those leading questions, does
Sure.
applying test optional really not disadvantage you in the admission process?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think,
Yeah.
for us, I think test optional and test flexible, there's all this nomenclature in the testing space that
Mm,
is a little bit difficult to figure out. But I think fundamentally, and, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, that transcript is the foundation of what we're
mhm,
looking at, right? In many cases, standardized testing will often confirm what we already knew about students. I think, students in a way, prior to a lot of the highly selective institutions, like Emory, prior to them going test optional, they didn't have a choice, right? Is submit the SAT or ACT, and it is what it is. And in some ways, that was a little bit of a gift for students because it took the burden off of them of having to make all these decisions. Do I submit?
mhm,
Do I not submit? What do I submit? How do I do this, right? And so, yeah, it wasn't the most pleasant experience for me who took standardized tests all the way through and then submitted them. I knew what I had to do. It was pretty clear, cut and dry. Now I think it's a more complicated
mhm,
ecosystem and the conversations have evolved accordingly. But I think students, it does give them a little bit more autonomy in the process, which is, a gift and a curse, right?
mhm,
You kind of get to control your fate a little bit, saying, oh, I did really well on my calculus AB exam at the end of junior year. I want to submit that, but I don't want to submit my ACT, right? And so
mhm,
you can kind of choose how you self present. Or, hey, my transcript's great. I'm really happy with that. I'm just going to submit that. And, the conversations we have are, particularly the highly selective institutions, again, we're starting with the transcript, but testing is not and has never really driven our selection process here at Emory. It's sort of been like a covariate, if you will, kind of outside. But what I think is really interesting is I think COVID showed a lot of institutions that students may have been overvaluing their testing.
mhm, mhm,
Students were looking at ranges of colleges and seeing the 25th and 75th percentile. They're looking at their testing and saying, you know what? I'm not going to apply. I'm not going to get in. And COVID kind of threw that out the window. We saw massive changes in the demographics and the types of students that were applying. And it was really, really great for Emory. And our faculty spoke pretty clearly about that here at Emory, saying, hey, we are seeing really fantastic and excellent students. And so for us, here at Emory, we're finding still that about a third of our students coming in didn't submit SAT or ACT scores. So
mhm. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you again so much for coming. Your insights have been really helpful.
thank you, Sally. I really appreciate it. Wishing you and all your listeners a great 2025.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right, so we will be back in just a couple minutes with my colleague Michelle Clifton for the federal loan update.